Welcome to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. And hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews. And if this is your first time, please go back into the playlist and watch from the very beginning of the playlist. Or if you're on Rumble, please go to episode 2 to be able to get to the very beginning of these reads as I read to you. And this is episode 77, part 2 of Bernal, Diaz del Castillo, and the true history of the conquest of New Spain. So, let's jump into it with our American literature lesson. Cortez and difficulties. There was never a time when we were not subject to surprises so dangerous that but for God's help they would have cost us our lives. Footnote. Diaz is writing here of a complex period in the history of the Cortez invasion. In the winter that followed his entrance to Tenochtitlan, Cortez had taken Montezuma hostage under the pretense of protecting him, and thus had effective control of the city and much surrounding territory. Cortez began a search for gold mines, built a flotilla to sail on the city's lakes, and ordered the removal of the native idols from the temples. His control of the country was far from complete, however, and as troubles emerged among the Aztec ruling class, the priests, by the following spring, a party of Spanish soldiers under Pamphilio de Narvaez landed near Villarica, Veracruz, with the intent of arresting Cortez on orders from Diego Velázquez. No sooner had we set up the image of Our Lady on the altar and said Mass than Huichilobos and Tezcatlipoca seem to have spoken to their papas. Footnote. Priests. Huichilobos is the Aztec god of war, and Tezcatlipoca the god of creation, telling them that they intended to leave their country since they were so ill-treated by the Teules. They said that they did not wish to stay there where these figures and the cross had been placed, nor would they stay unless we were killed. This, they said, was their answer, and the papas need expect no other, but must convey it to Montezuma and all his captains, so that they might at once attack us and kill us. Their gods also observed that they had seen us break up the gold that was once kept in their honor and forge it into ingots, and warned the Mexicans that not only had we imprisoned 5 great caciques, but were now making ourselves masters of their country. They recited many more of our misdeeds in order to incite their people to war. Wishing us to hear what his gods had said, Montezuma sent Ortiguilla, footnote, a young Aztec who served as page for Cortez, to our captain, with the message that he wished to speak to him on a very serious business. The page said that Montezuma was very sad and agitated, and that on the previous night, and during much of the day, many papas and important captains had been with him, holding secret discussions which he could not overhear. On receiving this message, Cortez hurried to the palace where Montezuma was, taking with him Cristobal de Olid, the captain of the guard, and 4 other captains, also Donna Marina and Geronimo de Aguilar, and paid great respect to the great Montezuma, who addressed them in these words: My lord. Footnote. Aguilar, shipwrecked on the Yucatan coast of 1511, had been ransomed from the Mayans by Cortez. His expertise in the Mayan language made him of vital assistance during the invasion. All paid great respect to the great Montezuma, who addressed them in these words: My lord, Malinche and captains, I am indeed distressed at the answer in which our Teules have given to our papas, to me and to all my captains. They have commanded us to make war on you and kill you and drive you back across the sea. I have reflected on this command and think it would be best that you should at once leave this city before you are attacked, and leave no one behind. This, my lord Malinche, you must certainly do, for it is in your own interest. Otherwise you will be killed. Remember that your lives are at stake. Cortez and our captains were distressed and even somewhat alarmed, which was not surprising, for the news was so sudden and Montezuma was so insistent. Hold on. One moment. We're having video issues. Okay. Cortez and our captains were distressed and even somewhat alarmed, which was not surprising, for the news was so sudden and Montezuma was so insistent that our lives were in the greatest and immediate danger. The matter was clearly urgent. Cortez replied by thanking him for the warning and saying that all the moment he was troubled by 2 things: that he had no ships in which to depart, since he had ordered those in which we came to be broken up, and that Montezuma would have to accompany us, so that our great emperor might see him. He begged him as a favor, therefore, to restrain his papas and captains until 3 ships could be built in the sand dunes. This course, he argued, would be to their advantage, for if they began a war they would all be killed. And to show that he really meant to build these ships without delay, he asked Montezuma to tell his carpenters to go with 2 of our soldiers, who were expert shipbuilders, and to cut wood near the coast. On hearing Cortez say that he would have come with us and visit the emperor, Montezuma was even sadder than before. He said that he would let us have the carpenters, and urged Cortez to hurry up and not waste time in talk, but get to work. In the meantime, he promised to tell his papas and captains not to foment disturbances in the city, and to see that Huey Chilibos was appeased with sacrifices, though not of human lives. After this excited conversation, Cortez and our captain took their leave of Montezuma, and we were all left in great anxiety, wondering when the fighting would begin. Cortez immediately sent for Martin Lopez, the ship's carpenter, and Andre Nunez. Nunez was an expert shipbuilder, often put to work on such projects during the conquest, and the Indian carpenters whom Montezuma had lent us, and after some discussion about the size of the 3 vessels to be built, he ordered Lopez to start work at once and get them ready. for all that was necessary in the way of iron and blacksmith's tackle, tow, caulkers, and tar was to be found at Villarica. So they set out and the wood and cut the wood near the coast, and after making calculations and templates, hastily began to build the ships. Meanwhile, we in Mexico went about in a great depression, fearing that at any moment we might be attacked. Our Talascan auxiliaries and Donna Marina told Cortez that this was imminent, and that the page, Ortiguilla, was always in tears. We all kept on the alert and placed a strong guard on Montezuma. I say that we were on the alert, but I do not have to repeat this so often, since we never took off our armor, gorgets, or leggings by night or day. Some may ask when we slept, and what our beds were like. They were nothing but a little straw and a mat, and anyone who had a curtain put underneath them. We slept in our armor and sandals, with our weapons close beside us. The horses stood saddled and bridled all day, and everything was so fully prepared that at a call to arms we were already at our posts and waiting. We posted sentinels every night, and every soldier did his guard duty. There is something else I would say, though I do not like to boast. I grew so accustomed to going about armed and sleeping in the way I have described, that after the conquest of New Spain, I kept the habit of sleeping in my clothes and without a bed. I slept better that way than on a mattress. Even when I go to the villages in my encomienda, footnote, a grant of Native Americans with their lands, supposedly to encourage their conversion to Christianity. In practice, the encomienda system degenerated into slavery. Diaz's encomienda was located in Guatemala. I do not take a bed, or if I sometimes do, it is not because I want it, but because some gentlemen are traveling with me, and I do not wish them to think I do not possess a good bed. But I always lie down fully dressed. What is more, I can only sleep for a short time at night. I have to get up and look at the sky and stars and walk about for a bit in the dew. And this without putting a cap or a handkerchief on my head. I am so used to that, thank God. It does me no harm. I have said all of this so that my readers shall know how we, the true conquistadors, lived, and how accustomed we became to our arms and to keeping watch. One day, when our captain went to make his usual state visit on Montezuma, he noticed, after the unusual civilities, that Montezuma appeared more cheerful and happy. He asked him how it was, and Montezuma replied that his health was better. But when Cortez paid him a second visit on the same day, the prince was afraid that he had learnt about Narvaez's ships. So, to get the advantage of our captain and to avoid suspicion, he said, "Lord Malinche, just a moment ago some messengers came to tell me that 18 or more ships with a great many men and horses have arrived at the port where you disembarked. They brought me a picture of it all painted on cloths. And seeing you visiting me for a second time today, I thought you had come to bring me the same news. For now you will not need to build ships, but you have told me nothing about it. So I have been annoyed with you, on the one hand, for keeping me in ignorance, and delighted, on the other hand, at the arrival of your brothers. For now you can all return to Spain without more discussion." When Cortez heard about the ships and saw the painting on the cloth, he rejoiced greatly. "Thank God, who provides for us at the right time," he said, and we soldiers were so pleased that we could not keep quiet. The horsemen rode skirmishing around, and musket shots were fired, but Cortez grew very thoughtful, for he knew quite well that the fleet had been sent against him and us by the governor Diego Velasquez. Being a wise man, he told his soldiers and captains what he felt, and by the great gifts of gold and promises to make us rich persuaded us to stand by him. He did not yet know who was in command of the fleet, but he was highly delighted with news, and with the gold he had given us by way of gratuity, since it came from his own property and not from what should have fallen into our share. Our Lord Jesus Christ was indeed sending us help and assistance. The destruction of Tenochtitlan. Just then, many companies of Mexicans came down the causeway, wounding us all, including the horsemen. Sandoval, footnote, a cavalry officer and close associate of Cortez's returned to the coast to meet Narvaez in the spring of 1520, leaving half his men under the command of Pedro de Alvarado in the Aztec capital. After decisively defeating Narvaez and convincing his army to join his cause, Cortez hurried back to Tenochtitlan, enlisting many native allies en route. Badly managed by Alvarado, affairs were in deep confusion when Cortez arrived late in June. Montezuma, now a captive of the invaders, set up as a figurehead, was forced to plead for calm, only to be struck down by stones hurled by his people. He soon died, either from the resulting injuries or from stab wounds of uncertain but probably Spanish origin. Cortez was forced to flee the city shortly thereafter, in a long bloody retreat during what became known as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrow. He was able to regroup against and eventually attack the following winter. This account of the slow but finally devastating Spanish victory, which was secured in 1521, begins here with the chilling tale of how some of 6 Spanish captives were sacrificed earlier that summer, as their companions, barely escaping over a causeway, looked back in horror at the temple of the war god. Sandoval, too, received a stone full in the face. But Pedro de Alvarado and some other horsemen went to his assistance, as so many bands were coming on, and only I and 20 soldiers were opposing them. Sandoval ordered us to retire gradually in order to save the horses, and because we did not retire as quickly as he wished, he turned on us furiously and said, "Do you want me and all my horsemen to be killed because of you? For my sake, Bernal, Diaz, my friend, please fall back." Then Sandoval received another wound, and so did his horse. By this time, we had got out our allies off the causeway, and facing the enemy, and never turning our backs, we gradually retired, forming a kind of dam to hold up their advance. Some of our crossbowmen and musketeers shot while the others were loading. The horsemen made charges, and Pedro Moreno, footnote, an artillery officer, loaded and fired his cannon. Yet despite the number of Mexicans that were swept away by his shot, we could not keep them at bay. On the contrary, they continued to pursue us in the belief that they would carry us off that night to be sacrificed. When we had retired almost to our quarters, across the great opening full of water, their arrows, darts, and stones could no longer reach us. Sandoval, Francisco de Lugo, and Andres de Tapia, a soldier who also wrote an account of the conquest, were standing with Pedro de Alvarado, each one telling his story and discussing Cortez's orders, when the dismal drum of Huy Chilibos sounded again, accompanied by conches, horns, and trumpet-like instruments. It was a terrifying sound. And when we looked at the tall queue from which it came, we saw our comrades who had been captured in Cortez's defeat being dragged up the steps to be sacrificed. When they had hauled them up to the small platform in front of the shrine where they kept their accursed idols, we saw them put plumes on the heads of many of them, and then they made them dance with a sort of fan in front of Huichilobos. Then, after they had danced, the papas laid them down on their backs on some narrow stones of sacrifice, and cutting open their chests, drew out their palpitating hearts, which they offered to the idols before them. Then they kicked the bodies down the steps, and the Indian butchers who were waiting below cut off their arms, legs, and flayed their faces, which they afterwards prepared like leather, with their beards on, and kept for their drunken festivals. Then they ate their flesh with a sauce of peppers and tomatoes. They sacrificed all our men in this way, eating their legs and arms, offering their hearts and blood to their idols, as I have said, and throwing their trunks and entrails to the lions and tigers and serpents and snakes that they kept in the wild beast houses I have described in an earlier chapter. On seeing these atrocities, all of us in our camp said to one another, "Thank God they did not carry me off to be sacrificed." My readers must remember that though we were not far off, we could do nothing to help, and could only pray God to guard us from such a death. And then, at the very moment of the sacrifice, great bands of Mexicans suddenly fell upon us and kept us busy on all sides. We could find no way of holding them. "Look," they shouted, "that is the way you will all die, as our gods have many times promised us," and that they lost their spirits. The Mexicans threw them roasted legs of Indians and the arms of our soldiers, with the cries of, "Eat the flesh of these tuiles and of your brothers, for we are glutted with it. You can stuff yourselves on our leavings. Now see these houses you have pulled down. We shall make you build them again, much finer, with white stone and fine masonry. So go on helping the tuiles, and you will see them all sacrificed." Guatemala, a young Aztec chieftain who had led the repulse of Cortez the year before, he had become the Lord of Mexico and now was making heroic efforts to defeat Cortez for good. Cortez executed him in 1524. Guatemala did something more after his victory. He sent the hands and feet of our soldiers, and the skin of their faces, and the heads of their horses that had been killed, to all the towns of our allies and friends, and their relations, with the message that as more than half of us were dead, he would soon finish off the rest. They had better break their alliance with us and come to Mexico, because if they did not desert us quickly, he would come and destroy them. The Mexicans went on attacking us day by day and night, and we all kept guard together. Gonzalo de Sandoval, Pedro de Alvarado, and all the other captains included. So although great bands of warriors came by night, we were able to repel them both by day and night, half the horsemen remaining in Tacuba, a city west of Tenochtitlan, and the other half on the causeway. But this was not all the harm we suffered. The enemy returned and reopened all the channels that we had blocked since we had first advanced along the causeway, and built even stronger barricades than before. Then our friends from the cities on the lake, who had recently allied themselves to us, were coming to help us with their canoes, decided that they had come for wool, but gone away shorn. For many of them lost their lives, and many went home wounded, and more than half their canoes were destroyed. But even so, they did not help the Mexicans any more, for they loathed them. They stood aside, however, and watched events. Cuauhtémoc and his captains thanked Cortez for this assurance. Footnote: Diaz has just told how, with Tenochtitlan in the hands of the Spanish, Cortez assured the capture of Cuauhtémoc, that the latter would continue to rule over Mexico. Then Cortez asked after his wife and the other great ladies, wives of other captains, whom he knew to have come with the prince, and Cuauhtémoc himself answered that he had begged Gonzalo de Sandoval and Garcia Hoguin. Footnote: a Spanish sea captain responsible for the capture of Cuauhtémoc, to leave them in their canoes while he came to learn Malinche's orders. Cortez at once sent for them and ordered that they should be given of the best we had in the camp to eat. Then, as it was late and it was beginning to rain, he arranged for them to be sent to Coyoacan, taking Cuauhtémoc, his family and household, and many other chieftains with him. He ordered Pedro de Alvarado, Gonzalo de Sandoval, and the other captains, each to go to his own camp and quarters. We went to Tacuba, Sandoval to Tepequilla, a city north of Tenochtitlan, and Cortez himself to Coyoacan. Cuauhtémoc and his captains were captured on the evening of 13 August 1521. Thanks be to our Lord Jesus Christ and Our Lady Virgin Mary, his blessed mother. It rained and thundered that evening, and the lightning flashed, and up to midnight heavier rain fell than usual. After Cuauhtémoc's capture, all we soldiers became as deaf as if all the bells in a belfry had been ringing, and had then suddenly stopped. I say this because during the whole 93 days, an exaggerated figure, of our siege of the capital, Mexican captains were yelling and shouting night and day, mustering the bands of warriors who were to fight on the causeway, and calling to the men in the canoes who were to attack the launches and struggle with us on the bridges and build barricades, or to those who were driving in piles and deepening and widening the channels and bridges and building breastworks, or to those who were making javelins and arrows, or to the women shaping rounded stones for their slings. Then there was the unceasing sound of their accursed drums and trumpets, and their melancholy kettle drums in the shrines and on their temple towers. Both day and night the din was so great that we could hardly hear one another speak. But after Guatemoc's capture, all the shouting and the other noises ceased, which is why I have made the comparison with a belfry. Guatemoc was very delicate in both body and features. His face was long but cheerful, and when his eyes dwelt on you, they seemed more grave than gentle, and did not waver. He was 26, and his complexion was rather lighter than the brown of most Indians. They said he was a nephew of Montezuma, the son of one of his sisters, and he was married to one of Montezuma's daughters, a young and beautiful one. Now to speak of the dead bodies and heads that were in the houses where Guatemoc had taken refuge, I solemnly swear that all the houses and stockades in the lake were full of heads and corpses. I do not know how to describe it, but it was the same in the streets and the courts of Tlatelolco. We could not walk without treading on the bodies and heads of dead Indians. I have read about the destruction of Jerusalem, but I do not think the mortality was greater there than here in Mexico, where most of the warriors who had crowded in from all the provinces and subject towns had died. As I have said, the dry land and the stockades were piled with corpses. Indeed, the stench was so bad that no one could endure it, and for that reason each of us captains returned to his camp after Guatemoc's capture. Even Cortez was ill from the odors which assailed his nostrils and from headache during those days in the Tlatelolco. The soldiers in the launches came off best and gained most spoil because they were able to go to the houses in certain quarters of the lake where they knew there was cloth, gold, and treasure. They also searched the reed beds in which the Mexicans had hidden their property when we were assaulting some quarter or group of houses, under cover of chasing the canoes that were bringing in food and water. They would sometimes capture some chieftains fleeing to the mainland to take refuge in the towns of their neighbors. The Otomis, footnote, one of the constituent peoples of Tlaxcala, neighbors, but not allies of the Aztecs, and would rob them of everything they had. We soldiers, on the other hand, who were fighting on the causeways and on land, gained no profit, but plenty of arrows and lance thrusts, and wounds from darts and stones. For when we captured houses, the inhabitants had already carried off any property they possessed, since we could not go through the water without first blocking the gaps and bridges. Therefore, as I said, when speaking of Cortez, search for sailors to go in the launches. They were better off than we who fought on land. This was clearly proved when Cortez demanded Montezuma's treasure from Guatemoc and his captains. They told him that the men in the launches had stolen most of it. As there was such a stench in the city, Guatemoc asked Cortez's permission for all the Mexican forces who remained there to go out to the neighboring towns, and they were promptly told to do so. For 3 whole days and nights they never ceased streaming out, and All three causeways were crowded with men, women, and children, so thin, sallow, dirty, and stinking that it was pitiful to see them. Once the city was free from them, Cortez went out to inspect it. We found the houses full of corpses, and some poor Mexicans still in them who could not move away. Their excretions were the sort of filth that thin swine pass, which have been fed on nothing but grass. The city looked as if it had been plowed up. The roots of any edible greenery had been dug out, boiled, and eaten, and they had even cooked the bark of some of the trees. There was no fresh water to be found. All of it was brackish. I must also remark that the Mexicans did not eat the flesh of their own people, only that our men and our Tlaxcalan allies, whom they had captured. There had been no live births for a long time, because they had suffered so much from hunger and thirst and continual fighting. Cortez ordered a banquet to be held in Coyoacan to celebrate the capture of the city, and got plenty of wine for the purpose from a ship that had just come from Spain to Villarica. Also some pigs that had been brought to him from Cuba. He invited all of us captains and soldiers whom he thought worthy of the consideration from all three camps. But when we came to the banquet, there were not enough seats or tables, or even a third of the invited guests. Consequently, there was much disorder, so many discreditable things occurred. Indeed, that it would have been better if the banquet had never been held. Now that our daily and mighty battles with the Mexicans are far away in the past, for which I give great thanks to God to be delivered, who delivered me from them, there is one thing that I wish to relate, which happened to me after seeing the death by sacrifice of 62 soldiers who were carried off alive. What I am going to say may seem to some to arise from my lack of any great inclination for battle, but on the contrary, anyone will see on reflection that it was due rather to the excessive daring with which I had to risk my life in the thickest of fighting. For great courage was at that time required of a soldier. I must say that when I saw my comrades dragged up each day to the altar, and their chests struck open, and their palpitating hearts drawn out, that when I saw the arms, legs of these 62 men cut off and eaten, I feared that one day or another they would do the same to me. Twice already they had laid hands on me to drag me off, but it pleased God that I should escape from their clutches. When I remembered their hideous deaths, and the proverb that the little pitcher goes many times to the fountain, and so on, I came to fear death more than ever in the past. Before I went into battle, a sort of horror and gloom would seize my heart, and I would make water once or twice, and commend myself to God and his blessed mother. It was always like this before battle, but my fear quickly left me. It must seem very strange to my readers that I should have suffered from this unaccustomed terror, for I had taken part in many battles, from the time when I made the voyage of discovery with Francisco Hernandez de Cordoba, Cordoba, till the defeat of our army on the causeway under the Alvarado. But up to that time, when I saw the cruel deaths inflicted on our comrades before our very eyes, I had never felt such fear as I did in these last battles. Let those experienced in soldiering, who have been at times in great peril of death, say whether my fear is to be attributed to faint-heartedness or to excessive valor, for, as I have said, my own opinion is that having to thrust myself, when fighting, into such dangerous positions, I was bound to fear death more at that time than at others. Besides, I was not always in good faith. I was many times severely wounded, and for this reason was not able to go on all the expeditions. Still, the hardships and risks of death to which I was personally exposed were not insignificant, either before the capture of Mexico or afterward. The first orders Cortes gave to Guatemala were that the conduits from Chapultepec, footnote, a town on the site of a fine spring southwest of Mexico City. Water flowed from it via an aqueduct to the capital, should be repaired and restored to their former condition, so that the water could flow again into the city, that the streets should be cleared of the bodies and the heads of the dead, which should be buried, so that the city should be left clean and free from any stench, that all bridges and causeways should be thoroughly restored to their former condition, and the palaces and houses rebuilt so as to be fit for habitation within 2 months. He marked out the paths in which the Indians were to settle, and those which were to be left clear for us. Guatemala and his captains complained to Cortes that many of our men had carried off the daughters and wives of chieftains, and begged him as a favor that they should be sent back. Cortes answered that it would be difficult to take them from their present masters, but they might seek them out and bring them before him, and he would see whether they had become Christians or preferred to go home with their fathers and husbands, in which case he would order them to be given up, so that the Mexicans permission to search in all 3 camps, and issued an order that any soldier who had an Indian woman should surrender her at once, if she of her own free will wished to return home. Many chieftains searched from house to house and persevered until they found them, but there were many women who did not wish to go with their fathers and mothers or husbands, but preferred to remain with the soldiers with whom they were living. Some hid themselves, others said they did not wish to return to idolatry, and yet others were already pregnant, so they did not bring back more than 3, who, by Cortes's express command, were handed over to them. Everyone was agreed that all the gold and silver and jewels in Mexico should be collected together, but this seems to have amounted to very little, for there was a report that Guatemala had thrown all the rest into the lake 4 days before we captured them, and that the Tlaxcalans and the people of the Huizotzingo and Cholula, footnote, independent states of the East Mexico City, to the east of Mexico City, near Tlaxcala, and all the rest of our allies who had taken part in the war. Also the Teules themselves, who went about in the launches, had stolen their share. The officers of the royal treasury publicly proclaimed, therefore, that Guatemala had hidden the treasure, and that Cortes was delighted, since he would not have to give it up, but could keep it all for himself. For this reason, these officers decided to torture Guatemala and his cousin, the Lord Tacabra, who was his great favorite. Cortes and some of the rest of us were very much distressed. that they should torture a prince like Guatemoc for greed of gold. Thorough injuries about the Thorough inquiries about the treasure had been made, and all Guatemoc's stewards had said that there was no more than the king's officials already had, which amounted to 380,000 gold pesos, and had been melted in and cast into bars. The inculcated no, and malted, mulcid, mulcid, malted of the royal fifth and another fifth for Cortes. On finding that the sum was so little, Cortes's enemies among the conquistadors and Narvaez's men, who distrusted him, told the treasury Julian de Alderete that they suspected him of opposing the arrest and torture of Guatemoc and his captains only because he wanted to keep the gold for himself. So, to avoid making any accusations against Cortes, who could not prevent their actions, they tortured Guatemoc and the Lord Tacaba by burning their feet with oil, and extorted the confession that 4 days before they had thrown the gold into the lake, together with the cannon and muskets they had captured from us when they drove us out of Mexico. The place Guatemoc indicated was the palace in which he had lived, where there was a large pond from which we fished up a great golden sun like the one that Montezuma had given us, and many jewels and articles of small value which belonged to Guatemoc himself. The Lord Tacaba said that in his house at Tacaba, about 12 miles away, he had some gold objects, that if we would take him there, he would tell us where they buried and give them to us. Pedro de Alvarado and 6 soldiers, myself among them, took him there. But when we arrived, he said he had only told us the story in hopes of dying on the road, and invited us to kill him, for he possessed neither gold nor jewels. So we returned empty-handed. The truth is that Montezuma's treasure chamber, of which Guatemoc took possession at his death, did not contain many jewels or golden ornaments, because all the best had been extracted to form the magnificent offering that we had sent to his majesty, which was worth twice as much as the fifth deducted for him and Cortes's own fifth as well. This we sent to the emperor by Alonso de Avila, who had just returned from the island of Santo Domingo. We captains and soldiers were all somewhat sad when we saw how little gold there was, and how poor and mean our shares would be. The Mercedarian friar, the Mercedarian order, or the Order of Our Lady of Mercies, was founded in Barcelona early in the 13th century. Pedro de Alvarado, Cristobal de Olid, and other captains told Cortes that since there was so little gold, the entire share would fall to us ought to be divided among those who were maimed and lame and blind, or who had lost an eye or their hearing, and others who were crippled or had pains in their stomachs, or had been burnt by the powder, or were suffering from pains in their sides. They said it was only right that it should all be given to them, and that the rest of us who were more or less sound ought to approve. After due consideration, they repeated this to Cortes, believing that he would increase our shares, for there was a strong suspicion that he had hidden all the gold away and ordered Guatemoc to say that he had none. Cortez replied that he would see we came out all right, and would take measures to that effect. As we were all anxious to see what our share would be, we were in a hurry for the accounts to be issued. After making the calculation, they told us a horseman would receive 80 pesos, and a crossbowman, musketeer, or shield bearer 50 or 60. I do not remember which. And when we heard this figure, not a single soldier was willing to accept his share. While Cortez was in Coyoacan, he lodged in a palace with whitewashed walls, on which it was easy to write with charcoal and ink, and every morning malicious remarks appeared, some in verse and some in prose, in the manner of lampoons. One said the sun, moon, and stars, and earth and sea followed their courses, and if they ever deviated from the plane for which they were created, soon reverted to their original place. So it would be with Cortez's ambition for command. He would soon return to his original condition. Another said that he had dealt us a worse defeat than Law had given to Mexico, and that we ought to call ourselves not the victors of New Spain, but the victims of Herman Cortez. Another said that he had not been content with a general share, but had taken a king's, not counting other profits. And yet another, my soul is very sad, and will be till the day when Cortez gives us back the gold he's hidden away. It was also remarked that Diego Velazquez had spent his whole fortune and discovered all the northern coast as far as Panuco, and then Cortez had come to enjoy the benefit and rebelliously taken both the land and the treasure, and other words were written up too, unfit to record in this story. When Cortez came out of his quarters of a morning, he would read these lampoons. Their style was elegant, the verses well rhymed, and each couplet not only had point, but ended with a sharp reproof that was not so naive as I may have suggested. As Cortez himself was something of a poet, he prided himself on composing answers which tended to praise his own great deeds and belittle those of Diego Velazquez, Grijalva, and Francisco Hernandez de Cordoba. In fact, he too wrote some good verses which were much to the point, but the couplets and sentences they scrawled up became every day more scurrilous, until in the end Cortez wrote, "A blank wall is a fool's writing paper." The next morning someone added, "A wise man's too, who knows the truth, as his Majesty will do very soon." Knowing who is responsible for this, a certain Tirado, a friend of Diego Velazquez, and some others who wished to make their defiance clear, Cortez flew into a rage and publicly proclaimed that they must write up no more libels, or he would punish the shameless villains. Many of us were in debt to one another. Some owed 50 or 60 pesos for crossbows, and others 50 for a sword. Everything we had brought was equally dear. A certain surgeon, called Maestre Juan, who tended some baboons, charged excessive prices for his cures, and so did a sort of quack by the name of Murcia, who was an apothecary and barber, and also treated wounds, and there were 30 other tricks and swindles for which payment was demanded out of our shares. The remedy that Cortez provided was to appoint 2 trustworthy persons who knew the prices of goods and could value anything that we had bought on credit. An order went out that whatever price was placed on our purchases or the surgeon's cures must be accepted, and that we had no money. Our creditors must wait 2 years for payment. And I must say that in the end, in compensation for slaves sold by auction, the remaining gold all fell to the king's officials. When Cortez found that many of the soldiers were still insolently demanding larger shares, and saying that he had stolen everything for himself, and begging him to lend them money, he decided to free himself from their clutches and send them to settle in any province that seemed to him suitable. When the news spread through all these distant provinces that Mexico was destroyed, that their caciques and lords could not believe it. However, they sent chieftains to congratulate Cortez on his victories and yield themselves as vassals. To his majesty, and to see if the city of Mexico, which they had all so dreaded, was really razed to the ground. They all carried great presents of gold to Cortez, and even brought their small children to show them Mexico, pointing it out to them in much the same way that we would say, "Here stood Troy." But let us leave this topic for another that richly deserves explanation. Many interested readers have asked me why the true conquistadors who won New Spain and the great and strong city of Mexico did not stay to settle, but went on to other provinces. I think this question is justified, and I will give them an answer. Learning from Montezuma's account books the names of the places which sent him tributes of gold, and where the mines and chocolate and cotton cloths were to be found, we decided to go to these places, and our resolve was strengthened when we saw so eminent a captain and so close a friend of Cortez as Gonzalo de Sandoval leaving Mexico, and when we realized that there was no gold, that there were no gold or mines or cotton in the towns around Mexico, only a lot of maize and maguey, an agave plant used by the Aztecs as a source of pulque, a fermented drink that in turn is the source of mezcal. Plantations from which they obtain their wine. For this reason, we thought of it as a poor land, and went off to colonize other provinces. But we were thoroughly deceived. I remember that when I went to ask Cortez for leave to go with Sandoval, he said to me, "On my conscience, Senor Bernal Diaz del Castillo, you are making a mistake. I wish you would stay here with me. But as you want to go with your friend Sandoval, go, and good luck to you. I shall always consider your wishes. But I know very well that you will be sorry you left." 1568. And that concludes the section on Bernal Diaz del Castillo. So, if you found this educational, if you found this entertaining, which is questionable, or enlightening, and would you please give me a like, subscribe, and share? This channel doesn't grow without you, you know. And if you have any questions, put them down in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you about it. So, or even if you just want to rag on my bad pronunciation, that'll be fine too. Comments welcome. And I wish you all a good evening. Good night, pretties. Much love to all of you.